The EEOC recently released 178-page enforcement guidance on harassment in the workplace. Let's take a peek and see what's new. The first thing that jumps out at me is this. Over 1/3 of the charges filed at the EEOC alleged harassment. That is a lot of harassment. The EEOC estimates up to 85% of women have experienced harassment in the workplace at some point during their careers. Most of these women will not complain about the harassment. About 3/4 of them never complain to a manager or union rep. And a study from the University of Massachusetts Center for Employment Equity found that 99.8% of them will never file a formal charge. And yet 1/3 of the charges at the EEOC include an allegation of harassment. Facing off against harassment can feel awful, but you're not alone. In fact, you're joining a long line of civil rights heroes. I was at the National Civil Rights Museum in Atlanta last week. There were profiles of so many people that I didn't know. Everyday people just like you who are fighting for their civil rights. The remarkable thing about this document is that it combines harassment for all types of bases: race, color, religion, sex, including pregnancy, childbirth, sexual orientation, gender identity, national origin, disability, genetic information, and age 40 or over. For sex-based harassment, the guidance includes harassment for using or not using contraception, or deciding to have or not to have an abortion. Here's an interesting example of harassment based on a pregnancy-related medical condition, in this case, morning sickness. Although the employer accommodates the pregnant employee by allowing her to work at home a few days a week, her colleagues complain that she's getting special perks and argue that she shouldn't be considered for an important account. And another, of sex-based harassment against a man who is given a hard time by coworkers after he returns from medical leave for having a vasectomy. As an example of harassment based on sexual orientation, the guidance includes outing, or disclosing an individual's sexual orientation or gender identity without permission, and misgendering, or repeating and intentionally using a name or pronoun inconsistent with the individual's known gender identity. And although the EEOC got pushback over this one, the guidance says sexual orientation harassment includes denial of access to a bathroom or other sex-segregated facility consistent with the individual's gender identity. The guidance argues that retaliatory harassment has a different standard, that the Supreme Court in Burlington Northern forbid anything that might deter a reasonable person from engaging in protected activity. And so retaliatory harassment can be challenged even if it is not sufficiently severe or pervasive to alter the terms and conditions of employment by creating a hostile work environment. But in our last episode, we talked about the court's decision in Muldrow, which said retaliation is only illegal if it causes significant harm. But you've got to love the EEOC's generous interpretation here of the standard for retaliatory harassment. Here they talk about intraclass harassment, where the harasser is a member of the same protected class as the person being harassed. I love this intersectional harassment example, where a woman is being harassed because she's menopausal. So she's being harassed based on her status as a woman and for being older. Here they talk about that someone being a jerk is not necessarily discriminatory harassment. It depends on treating a particular group poorly. That's different than discrimination on its face, which they call facially discriminatory conduct, which makes me think of discrimination based on having a big nose. But no, it's conduct that's explicit. The insults threaten an individual because of their protected characteristic. I like this. They talk about harassment based on stereotypes, like sex-based assumptions based on weight or body types. But they also discuss that harassment could be intended positively. So age-based harassment might include encouraging an older employee to retire so the employee can enjoy their golden years. Or sex-based harassment might include encouraging a woman with young children to switch to part-time so she can spend more time with her children. Context is important. So the context determines whether using the term boy to refer to a black man is harassment, or even terms that are not facially discriminatory, like you people, could operate as code words that contribute to a hostile work environment. Here's a good distinction. If an employee alleges that her supervisor subjected her to harassment based on sex and race, the combined effect of both is what's used to determine if it was severe or pervasive, not if the race-based harassment or the sex-based harassment on their own was sufficiently severe or pervasive. Some conduct may be more severe if it occurs in the presence of others, like colleagues or subordinates or clients, like sexually degrading comments, while other conduct may be more severe if it happens when the complainant is alone with the offending individual, because the isolation may enhance the threatening nature of the discriminatory conduct. Good stuff. Here's a list of examples where courts found a single incident was sufficiently severe to establish a hostile work environment. Sexual assault, okay, I see that. Sexual touching, physical violence, all right. The threat of physical violence, but some of these other ones, a symbol of violence, denigrating animal imagery, a single use of the N-word by a supervisor. These cases definitely happened, and these things are definitely terrible, but I think there are a lot of judges who might have made a different call if these were the only incidents of harassment. This is worth mentioning. Harassment is based on the perspective of a reasonable person in the complainant's position. So it requires an appropriate sensitivity to the social context. So if a Black individual alleges racial harassment, the harassment should be evaluated from the perspective of a reasonable Black individual in the same circumstances. And they take this a little farther to talk about personal or situational characteristics that might affect whether a complainant reasonably perceives conduct as creating a hostile work environment. So if an undocumented worker is targeted by harassment, then the heightened risk of deportation might contribute to objective hostility. Here's a good example of when someone can be harmed by harassment to someone else. In this example, the boss is harassing an employee for being Jewish and asks a second employee to help them in that harassment. And when they object, the boss says, if you want a future here, you better do what I tell you. So that second employee is forced to participate in the harassment. While they're not personally harassed, they're still entitled to whatever relief they experienced as a result of the harassment of the first employee. I don't think I've ever seen this before, but to avoid stating slurs in the document, they replaced letters with asterisks. So we have CR star PPLE. Slurs based on sexual orientation, they're 1-star slurs. H asterisk MO. D star KE. This one's involving a Muslim and it's M star ZZIE. I don't even know what that one is. Mother F star KER. That's pretty bad. But if it's in a footnote, it's F star CKIN. Maybe the mother makes it worse. But everywhere, the N word is a 4-star word, which is appropriate. This is a great point. People who are proxies or alter egos of the employer are automatically liable for harassment. Owners, partners, corporate officers, and managers at such a high level that they are considered to speak for the employer. While harassment by other supervisors requires the employee to make a complaint following the company's harassment policy and the employer to fail to take prompt and corrective action to stop it, for people who speak for the employer, that isn't necessary for the employer to be liable. Another person they discuss as being part of that supervisory class are people who have the power to recommend or otherwise substantially influence a tangible employment action. An employer is always liable if the harassment includes a tangible employment action, like denying a raise or a promotion. Threatening to take a tangible employment action is not itself a tangible employment action, but fulfilling a promise to provide a benefit because the complainant submits to sexual demands, like granting a promotion or not terminating the complainant, that would be a tangible employment action. Here, the guidance talks about the employer's responsibility to prevent harassment includes not just having a process to complain about harassment, but an anti-harassment policy and a training about that policy. The policy requires that supervisors report harassment that they're aware of and that there are multiple avenues for reporting harassment. Well, the training needs to discuss anti-retaliation provisions, give examples of impermissible harassment, and be provided on a regular basis to all employees. For an employer to show they're not liable in a harassment case, they have to prove both that they exercise reasonable care to prevent and promptly correct the harassment, and that the employee failed to take advantage of preventative or corrective opportunities. So in this example, the employee complained to a manager about harassment. The manager didn't do anything. Later, the employee complained to HR, and HR took appropriate action. But the employer cannot show that they acted reasonably to address the harassment because that first supervisor didn't do so. In the second example, a supervisor witnesses harassment, and even though the employer has an anti-harassment policy and a complaint process for harassment, which the employee fails to use, the employer still cannot show it acted reasonably to correct harassment because that supervisor failed to take action. There are times when an employee's failure to follow an employer's complaint process are reasonable, like when an employer failed to take appropriate corrective action in response to prior complaints, or because the employee had a reasonable fear of retaliation because the employee or another employee had previously experienced retaliation for complaining about harassment. After the employer learns of potentially harassing conduct, they need to do a prompt and adequate investigation and take appropriate action. Here, the EEOC talks about what's prompt and what's adequate. Waiting 2 months? Not prompt. Waiting 2 weeks? If it involves physical touching? Not prompt. Having someone conduct an investigation with no familiarity with EEO law and no experience conducting harassment investigations, who then does a perfunctory investigation? Not adequate. Here, the EEOC cites a Ninth Circuit decision that says taking prompt action includes intermediate steps to separate the harasser and the harassed while the investigation is ongoing in a way that doesn't negatively affect the person who complains about harassment. Definitely a best practice, even if all courts haven't said so yet. I thought there was some pretty good stuff in there. Now, if only the EEOC would regularly conduct prompt and adequate investigations of harassment, then we'd really be getting somewhere.